Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 10 of All About Nothing. Well, today I'm going to talk with you about something, and it's International Women's Month. So I thought I'd talk about something specifically about women, which I don't necessarily often do. And I thought I would talk about women's sexual health because in the trauma field, and certainly um, as in my experience, my very frustrated experience in this field, we generally only talk about sex when we're talking about sexual trauma. So I thought I would talk more generally about sex and about women's sexuality specifically. Now, as many of you know, for me, the sleep is one of those enigmas, and I'm rarely able to sleep much. But one of the great advantages of that is I'm often up, I'm usually up in what in many parts of the world is the middle of the night. For me, it's just an ordinary part of my routine, which for me locally is about 2 a.m. And at 2 a.m., I listen to BBC, which the UK is 8 hours later than me, so they often have really interesting, lively, good programming in what for me are the wee hours. So I often hear really good stuff during those times of the morning. And one of the programs that I really enjoy that you might want to look for because it's really great is called People Fixing the World. And it's always some kind of feel good topic about people doing really interesting, really positive things in the world that is so trauma and neglect, wrought, especially, seemingly, especially these days, which so much going on that is so unsavory. So I thought, well, I'll talk with you about sex today, which is not always unsavory. And what I found to my sort of shock and humility making surprise is that there's so much that I've never really thought about very much in terms of sexual health, women's sexual health, which has to do with women in other parts of the world. And this particular program was highlighting women in three countries specifically and talking about sexual things in those countries that frankly I'd never thought about or heard about or known much about. So I thought I'd share with you some of what I learned in this program. So the first segment of the program, the interviewer was speaking with a woman in Kenya, and this woman's name is Kaz, Kaz. She has a website, you can look for it if you're interested, called The Spread. And Kaz was somewhat already, well known as a rapper and an entertainer, starting already in the late 90s. But in 2016, she started talking more about sexuality. And Kaz talks about her introduction to sex education was when, and she couldn't remember the age, but her mother said to her, this is a quote, "The ugliest thing in the world is a naked man in socks. And that was Kaz's introduction to sex education. So Kaz grew up not knowing anything about anything, and meanwhile growing and developing into a queer person where there was no education, no information, lots of what was known to be certainly related to anything that was queer was, if not illegal, certainly taboo, and some sex acts were illegal. I don't know if they still are, but I think some of them are. Anyway, when Kaz went off to college, she began to learn and speak openly about queer topics. She began to learn about things like trans and things like intersex, and things became interesting to her. And she started talking about sex with women first close to her in her university, and then at a larger scale, because she found so many women in Kenya, particularly poor women, particularly women outside of the main cities, really didn't know anything about sex. So she started organizing groups and discussions and podcasts for people to learn about sexuality. And she found how little anyone knew about anything. So it was wonderful for her to actually begin to make inroads in her country where she could educate women not only about sex and, sexual consent, but even about pleasure, because so many women in Kenya had no idea about anything to do with their own pleasure. So Kaz went about teaching women about that. Starting in 2016, now she's got quite a movement. So I invite you to look up Kaz. Her website is called The Spread. You can find it, I believe it's through Facebook. But anyway, I found it. And then the program went on to another country, which was, I've heard about female genital mutilation, FGM, but she really began to explore the topic of FGM more in detail in the program, the interviewer did. And in Iraq, um, well, apparently in the world, the World Health Organization has identified the fact that in this world, there are 200 million women who have been subjected to female genital mutilation. FGM. And what FGM is when all the external parts of the female genitalia are cut off, are cut. And these women refer to themselves, and many refer to themselves simply as cut. And these women, many of whom um, were very poor, didn't know anything about, what the FGM was contributing to, that it contributed to not only really difficult, painful, unpleasant intercourse, but also infection, menstruation, and all kinds of difficulties that women might have throughout the month. And um, people were interviewed who didn't even know there was a category for sexual pleasure, let alone didn't know that any kind of pleasure was possible, that even though all the external parts of the women's genitalia had been cut, that the interior parts were, some parts of them still functioned, and there was actually an option for some extent of sexual pleasure. They had to learn about it, but also they got to learn about not only sexually transmitted diseases, but how FGM contributed to infections and what they could do about infections, let alone that there was a category not only for sexual pleasure, but for sexual consent. And and this person actually talked to women, one woman in particular who was in her middle 30s. She was the mother of 7 children. She didn't even know about sexual pleasure. She didn't even know there was such a thing as women's sexual pleasure. So, women educating other women, opening clinics, having discussion groups, actually teaching classes on pole dancing, where women could come and actually experience their sexuality, if not freely, at least privately, and have some of the pleasure of being in each other's company and experiencing their bodies in a positive way. So we visited Iraq, and then I was really interested and surprised to hear that the third country that was that was showcased in this program about women's sexual health and women's sexual pleasure was, of all places, Brazil. And I think of Brazil as being a really sexy place. And Brazil is the biggest country in Latin America. I haven't been there. It's one of the few places in Latin America I haven't been, but it's known for Carnival. It's known for its really sexy music and, the dance and, the whole genre, the whole image of Brazil, for me anyway, was always really sexy. And come to find out how repressed sexuality has been, certainly for women, and how this same person, Kaz, has done work in Brazil educating women about sexual pleasure, particularly in the countryside where the poor people live, in the favelas where women didn't even know anything about sexual pleasure. They were simply told when they were children, don't get too close to, boys because you'll get pregnant or you'll get some kind of transmitted disease or, something bad will happen. So don't go near other boys. But there wasn't any category for pleasure. So Kaz was teaching women in Brazil about sexuality and sexual pleasure. And what the World Health Organization and what many women have discovered is that sexual pleasure not only enhances sexual life and sexual relationship and health in general, but also it empowers women in other areas of their life, including in their relationships. So I learned a lot about international women's sexual health, and I was also reminded of my own experience with Betty Dodson. And Betty Dodson was a women's sexual health pioneer in the US. In the 1970s, she first wrote an article for the then brand new Ms. magazine about women's pleasure and women's orgasm, which was in those days barely known about and certainly not talked about, especially for Betty, who grew up in the sort of rural southern states of the US. And Betty was a highly sexual woman, and when she discovered orgasm and masturbation and women's pleasure, she wanted to tell everyone about it. And this was in the 1970s when the women's movement in the US was just starting to mushroom. And so Betty wrote an article for the then newly formed Ms. magazine, which was Gloria Steinem's new women's magazine, which was by, for, and about women. First one in this country, maybe in the world, I don't know. But anyway, Betty wrote an article about women's orgasm. And the original article was 18 pages long, and she submitted it to the newly developed Ms. Magazine, and she got a response to her inquiry about her article from Gloria Steinem, and basically the response that she got was, "We would be happy to run your article. However, we would like to cut the article down from 18 pages to 1.5 pages." And Betty was a little shocked to have her article shortened that much. She reluctantly agreed to it with the caveat that people who wanted to could send her $2 and a self-addressed stamped envelope, and Betty would send them the whole 18-page article. So Gloria agreed to that, and the article ran, and at the end of the article was this little notice that if people wanted the article, they could send $2 to Betty, and she would to send them the unedited article about women's pleasure and orgasm. Well, within 2 weeks after the article ran, Betty, who was a starving artist at that time, had received $20,000 in $1 bills of people who wanted the article. That's how much there was interest in women's sexual pleasure and women's orgasm. And from there, Betty started a whole tradition of doing women's groups where she taught gatherings of women to have orgasms together. And actually, one thing on my bucket list, which I definitely wanted to do before it was too late, and I actually accomplished, was to attend one of Betty's groups where she taught women how to have their orgasm, not because thankfully I needed to learn how, but I wanted to learn how she teaches women. Not that I would be able to in my practice, because my psychotherapy practice would not allow for hands-on, no pun intended, work, but rather I just wanted to see how Betty did it. And by then, Betty was almost 90 years old. This was, I think, 2014 or so, 2015. I can't remember exactly, but I made my pilgrimage to New York to attend one of Betty's workshops, which I've written about. You can read the article on my website if you'd like. Anyway, this is a tribute also to Betty, who passed away in 2021. So let's celebrate women's sexual health, women's orgasm, and Betty Dodson, who was also known as the orgasm doctor and wrote lots of books, including um, Sex for One and Masturbation for Two. She was a real advocate for masturbation, and Betty, till she died at the age of, I believe, 91, she she believed that part of her health regimen, part of her exercise routine was regular masturbation and regular orgasm, right until she was 91 years old. So, as an old lady, not as old as Betty, but let me encourage you to celebrate your sexual health, whatever your gender, whatever your sexual orientation, whatever your identity, whatever your trauma, neglect status. Enjoy your sexuality, enjoy your body, and celebrate women in this month of March. So thanks for joining us for episode number 10 of All About Nothing, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.